Good evening. My name is Larry Cimino, and I'm the president of the Indiana Council on World Affairs, and it's my pleasure to welcome our members and guests to this evening's Distinguished Speaker program focused on one of the U.S.'s strongest allies in the Middle East, the United Arab Emirates. Our speaker this evening is Ms. Shaima Hussein Gargash, the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of the United Arab Emirates in Washington, D.C. Before I ask my colleague Pierre Atlas to introduce our distinguished speaker, I want to mention a few things about the Indiana Council on World Affairs and our upcoming programs. This year, we've decided again to organize an in-person holiday event, which we've scheduled for Tuesday evening, December 7th, at the Northside Events and Social Club, beginning at 5:30 p.m. The event's open, it's open to members and to any other vaccinated persons who share our interest in international affairs and who'd like to get together to celebrate the season. So you'll receive more information within the next day or so, and you can register on our website. We hope to actually see you again in person then. This winter, we will again present the Great Decisions series in Indianapolis, hopefully in person, but with a hybrid Zoom broadcast for those who can't join in person. Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on world affairs. We'll be sending you additional information soon on the lineup of this season's 8 very interesting programs. So as an educational, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization with an all-volunteer board, we pride ourselves in organizing and hosting timely events of international importance in a format that promotes respectful dialogue and exchange of ideas on a wide range of topics. As always, we note that the views expressed by our distinguished speakers are their own and are not intended to represent the position of the ICWA, its board, or members. So for more information about the Indiana Council on World Affairs and all of our programs and events, please consult our website, indianaworld.org. After the initial interview, we'll open the floor to your questions, and we do encourage you to participate in the Q&A session. So you use the chat button at the bottom of your screen to send in your questions and select Pierre Atlas as the recipient rather than all. And because of a tight time schedule and some previous commitments this evening, we'll wrap up this program at 8 p.m. Our program this evening is brought to you with support from our season sponsor, the Indiana Economic Development Corporation. The Indiana Economic Development Corporation is committed to attracting and supporting new business investment, creating new jobs for Hoosiers, and furthering Indiana's legacy as one of the top states in the nation for business. We share their belief that global awareness is critical to the success of our students, our citizens, and our Indiana businesses in this interconnected world. I also want to thank all of our sponsors and donors. Every single contribution helps us deliver on our mission. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Pierre Atlas, who will be this evening's moderator, and he in turn will introduce our distinguished speaker. Dr. Pierre Atlas is a member of our ICWA Board of Directors. He's a senior lecturer at the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, and is a faculty affiliate and a member of the executive board of the Center for the Study of the Middle East at Indiana University, Bloomington. He also writes a monthly opinion column for the Indianapolis Business Journal. Dr. Atlas was previously professor of political science at Marian University, where he served as the founding director of the Richard G. Lugar Franciscan Center for Global Studies, and he directed their annual speaker series. A comparative political scientist by training, Dr. Atlas has devoted much of his academic career to studying and writing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. He received his PhD in political science from Rutgers University, his MA from the University of Arizona, and his BA from the University of Toronto. A native of Texas, Pierre grew up in California and is a U.S. Army veteran. Welcome, Pierre.
Good evening. Welcome, Larry. Thank you. Well, it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Ms. Shaima Hussein Gargash, who has served as the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of the United Arab Emirates in Washington, D.C. since 2019. Prior to her current position, Ms. Gargash was the head of communications and public diplomacy for over 2 years and was a political analyst at the UAE's Congressional Affairs Division before that. Before being assigned to Washington, D.C., Ms. Gargash led the policy division at the Policy Planning Department of the UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. She has previously worked in both the public and the private sectors dealing with economic and socio-political issues. In 2009, Ms. Gargash compiled an extensive research paper in collaboration with the Dubai School of Government on women's political participation in the UAE. Ms. Gargash also worked at corporate banking and real estate in Dubai prior to joining the government sector. She holds a Bachelor of Economics and a minor in International Relations from the American University of Sharjah and a Master's in Public Administration from Dubai School of Government in the UAE. Ms. Gargash is married to Mr. Fadel El Maheri, who is a filmmaker and scriptwriter, and they have 3 children. Shaima, welcome to the Indiana Council on World Affairs Distinguished Speaker Series, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Pierre. Thank you, Larry. Well, thank you all for having me here tonight. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm just going to share some slides with you as I go through my presentation, and hopefully it'll give you kind of a foundation to our conversation today. Okay. So these online engagements are a great way to get to know one another, and I hope you find today's discussion informative and useful. As Deputy Chief of Mission, or DCM, at the UAE Embassy in DC, I'm tasked with managing much of the day-to-day operations, making sure diplomats have what they need to help UAE citizens in the US. However, the best part of my job is, speaking, what I'm doing right now is speaking to you guys. 2021 is a big year for the UAE. This December marks the 50th anniversary of the UAE's founding. Today, I'll give you a brief overview of the history that shaped the UAE, so you can get a glimpse of the foundation and values that the country was built upon, and how this informs our friendship with the United States. Jeez. Okay. Next, I'll dig deeper into the ties that bridge the UAE and US, from economic relationships to social and cultural initiatives, and highlight some recent milestones that we have achieved together. I'm constantly amazed by how similar our cultures are. The value upon which the US was founded, opportunity, prosperity, community, are also what guided the UAE's leadership when the nation was established. I mentioned earlier that this year is the 50th anniversary of the UAE. So 2021 also marks 50 years of friendship between the UAE and US. In fact, the video that played for some of you in the waiting room before the session is from an exciting new storytelling campaign produced by the embassy. In 50 years, 50 faces, Emiratis and Americans have shared personal narratives and anecdotes that reflect on the breadth and depth of the UAE's history and relationship with the US. And I encourage you to view these stories on our campaign site, uaeusaunited.com, and stay tuned as more videos are being released. When the UAE is mentioned, many people think of oil and also ask, what is an emirate? Well, an emirate is a small city-state, and the UAE has 7 of them. Each emirate has its own laws and customs, but also 7 are united under a federal government, similar here to the United States. The Emirates you probably hear the most about are 2 Emirates: Abu Dhabi, the capital and the largest emirate, as well as Dubai, which is the 2nd largest and most populous. Oil wasn't always something associated with the UAE. In fact, a long time ago, the UAE's economy was dependent on local pearl diving industry. That lasted until the 1940s, when artificial pearls were invented. This was an early lesson for us in the importance of economic diversification. That's part of the reason we're working so hard to diversify on our energy mix, with major projects in solar and other renewable power sources. As a result of this dynamic approach, the UAE stands as the 2nd largest economy in the Arab world. The US was one of the first countries to establish formal diplomatic relations with the UAE. And these quick steps to build ties led to today's growing alliance. Our countries share robust and growing trade and commercial ties, much of which now has little direct relationship to UAE oil exports. The UAE has been the United States' top export destination for the entire Middle East and North Africa region for 12 years in a row. The UAE trades with every single US state, including Indiana. And in 2020, Indiana exported over $250 million in goods and services to the Emirates, making it the 18th largest exporter to the UAE among all 50 states that year. In fact, our Minister of Trade was just in Indiana in September. He met with Governor Holcomb and business leaders from the private sector to discuss economic opportunities between the UAE and Indiana. Cooperation between our countries has led to some remarkable achievements over the years, and we would like to highlight just a few of them here today. To begin, I'm sure some of you have heard about the UAE's recent diplomatic breakthrough in the Middle East. Last year, with support from the US, the UAE and Israel signed the Abraham Accords, which established diplomatic ties between our countries. And I don't need to tell you that in the Middle East, we are too familiar with discord and conflict. That's why signing the Abraham Accords was a major one, not just for the UAE and Israel, but for the future prospects of our region. The accords were signed between two governments, but the real beneficiaries of this agreement are the Emiratis and Israeli people. Within hours of the normalization announcement last summer, the pioneering and entrepreneurial spirit of the two peoples took over. Partnerships agreements were formed between scientists and research institutes to cooperate on COVID research. Business leaders began talking, technologists teamed up, tourists planned vacations, and the momentum has only continued to grow in the months since. Earlier this year, the UAE appointed His Excellency Mohammed Al Khaja, who you see on the left, as the very first UAE ambassador to Israel. And His Highness Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan, our foreign minister, recently participated in a historic trilateral meeting with his US and Israeli counterparts in DC. Here they are pictured on the right speaking at a dinner that same day. And something like this was unimaginable just a short time ago. The UAE-Israel agreement reflects the UAE's belief that like-minded countries must work together to expand opportunity, security, and prosperity for everyone. It's a starting point for a new and achievable vision for the region. But this wasn't the only milestone we reached in 2020. Last year, with the help of US academic partners, the UAE successfully launched the Arab world's first spacecraft to Mars. In fact, the UAE probe, which is called Hope or Al-Amal in Arabic, entered into orbit and Mars this past February. This picture on the right shows images that Hope has captured of Mars as it orbits the planet. Each color represents light collected at a different ultraviolet wavelength and provides information about Mars' upper atmosphere. The name of the probe is fitting because this mission is providing hope to an entire generation of young people in the Middle East who are tired of conflict and division and who want to apply their skills and talents in positive and productive ways. And I'm personally inspired by the women who make up 80% of the Emirates Mars mission science team. In fact, earlier this year, the UAE has also named its first female astronaut, Nura Madroshi, who's currently actually undergoing training at NASA in Houston right now. Programs like this are also part of the reason that in an annual survey, Arab youth have named the UAE as the country in the world they would most like to live and the one they would most like their own nation to emulate for the 10th straight year. Closer to home, the UAE is leading the way in promoting a culture of inclusion and acceptance in the Middle East. With more than 200 nationalities and people of countless faiths living and worshiping together side by side, the UAE is one of the most diverse societies in the world. And the values of mutual respect and freedom of worship are deeply ingrained in our country's DNA. One of the most visible expressions of these values came in 2019, when the UAE welcomed Pope Francis to Abu Dhabi. This marked the first visit by a sitting pope to the Arabian Peninsula and the birthplace of Islam. And this year we broke ground on the Abrahamic Family House, a new interfaith center in Abu Dhabi consisting of a mosque, a church, and a synagogue that will bring together followers of different religions in one space like never before. The United Arab Emirates also has a long track record as a leader in promoting gender equality in the Middle East region. From sports and science to government and the arts, women are playing increasingly large roles in all sectors across the country. In the UAE, more women than men complete secondary education and enroll in university and postgrad institutions. Emirati women are taking the lead in the public sector and make up 50% of the Federal National Council, which is the UAE's consultative legislature. For example, Her Excellency Mariam Al-Mahiri, the UAE's Minister of Climate Change and Environment, focuses on enhancing the nation's conservation efforts and combating climate change. I'm sure you've been hearing about the 2021 UN Climate Change Conference, or COP26, which just concluded after several weeks in Glasgow. Like the US, the UAE understand that climate change is an issue the global community must address collectively. And our countries are building on decades of bilateral ties to tackle this challenge together. Our joint initiatives not only accelerate efforts to meet climate goals, but will also enhance economic opportunity and diversification while creating knowledge, skills, and jobs in both countries. At COP26, the UAE and US officially launched the Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate. AIM for Climate has already raised $4 billion of increased investment to accelerate innovation for climate-smart agriculture and food systems over the next 5 years. These initiatives build on years of the Emirates demonstrating its commitment to climate action. Just last month, we announced our pledge to reach net zero emissions by 2050, and it has been confirmed that UAE will host COP28 in 2023 after Egypt in 2022. The UAE is also working closely with US partners and the international community to combat COVID-19. At the beginning of the pandemic, we at the UAE Embassy in Washington coordinated with our counterparts at the US mission in Abu Dhabi to ensure that US nationals in the UAE were repatriated safely back home and vice versa. Now, as the global vaccine efforts continue to ramp up, the UAE is leveraging its world-class logistics network to help distribute millions of WHO-provided vaccine doses to countries in need. Finally, Expo 2020 Dubai, the first World's Fair to be held in the Middle East, opened in October and will run through the end of next March. The UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation and the US Department of State work together to prepare the US Pavilion, and I'm excited to see these efforts come to fruition. As I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, the UAE's friendship with the US is built upon shared values and a vision for a better future. I hope this overview has provided a bit of insight into how the shared outlook has translated into real partnership that have put the region on a brighter path and brought benefits to Emiratis and Americans alike. And thank you for your attention, and I would be more than happy to answer your questions. Pierre?
There we go. Yes, I couldn't unmute myself for a minute. Okay, thank you. That was a very terrific presentation. Thank you, Shaima. I think we all got a lot of a very good flavor of all the exciting things taking place at the UAE. I think for just an opening question, I'd just like to ask, in addition to the presentation, what are a couple of things that you think Americans really would be surprised about the UAE? And maybe also you've been in the United States now for a few years. What things have sort of maybe surprised you about the United States as a diplomat from the UAE?
I think to answer the first half of your question, I think for many Americans who've never really been to the UAE and has just visited other countries in the Middle East, you'll notice how similar the UAE is to the United States. It's extremely cosmopolitan, it's extremely open. I think the one difference would be the extreme heat. But that again, you have some states that have, really hot weather. But I think you'll notice not only how cosmopolitan the UAE is, but you also see a lot of women in a lot of government entities in the private sector. You'll notice that a lot of people speak English in the UAE. We have less than 20% of our population are Emiratis, and so a big portion of them are expatriates. We have over 200 nationalities in the UAE. You'll hear everyone speaking, from Chinese, Hindi, Swahili, Russian, and so French too. And so it's just this kind of melting pot of just, a mini United Nations, that's surrounded by a border. And I think coming here to the United States, I've been here almost 7 years. I think Washington, D.C. specifically reminds me very much of Abu Dhabi. It's kind of the capital of diplomacy, where the politics happens, but it's also very discreet and quiet and very family oriented. I think the one thing I was surprised about is how much people kind of everything still revolves around family here, which I love. It's also very cosmopolitan here, which made me feel like home. So it's I didn't feel like I was leaving my home, going to another place. I feel like home here, which I think if you ask my kids, they'll tell you the United States is their country.
Very good. So you use the word cosmopolitan several times, and it makes me think, I mean, the UAE is in a very interesting place geographically because you are literally between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And there's a tremendous amount of tensions there. Both countries, not only are they geopolitical rivals, but they have very different understandings and formal practices and policies of Islam, whether it's Shiite or Sunni, compared to the UAE. How does the UAE maneuver between these two really great regional powers, and what positions does the UAE take in this tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran?
So yes, we are sandwiched between them, but we also have had a really long-standing relationship with both countries historically too. Again, countries will have differences. We can't control kind of their sovereign decision on how to take things. But our role as UAE, considering we're very close to to Iran and very close to Saudi, our approach is de-escalate, move towards a political dialogue, move towards diplomacy. Any further unrest, unraveling instability in the region is not good for anyone. And so, we, as UAE, we're there to ensure that all parties are talking to each other for the benefit of the region.
Very good, very good. And on that note, what is UAE's position on the Jcpoa, the Iran nuclear deal? So
the UAE is always looking forward and very much forward, in agreement to any agreement that would lead to any dialogue, any form of stability, any form of communication. The Jcpoa also needs to expand beyond just the nuclear issue with Iran. We are looking to not only to kind of expand beyond the nuclear element and include Iran's meddling in the region. We look forward to kind of the dialogues right now because the countries in the region are now being part of the dialogue, which is a kind of a win for everyone. And I think we are hopeful that we will get, the United States and Iran will get to an agreement for the benefit of the region and, for stability.
So on that note, you mentioned the Abraham Accords, which is a tremendous achievement. I mean, historic. Do you see the possibility of a strategic relationship between the UAE and Israel? And again, sort of sticking with that, but also getting back into the Iran deal. Israel is opposed to it, as is Saudi Arabia. There may be like the potential for a de facto alliance or partnership at some point between Saudi Arabia and Israel, but then that also puts Iran on the other side. How does the UAE fit with all of that, and what do you see as a future of any type of strategic relationship with Israel in this situation?
So when the UAE signed the Abraham Accords, the intent was to find new ways towards dialogue and communication and diplomacy. We also, we're moving towards this foreign policy of, we need to talk to all our neighbors, whether or not we have disagreements with them. And that's the way forward. The Abraham Accords is open for all. This is a bilateral agreement, but the benefits will not only benefit the people of both the countries, but will benefit the region. I tapped briefly on the MOUs and the agreements that we're both working on in terms of artificial intelligence and agro-technology and COVID and trade and opportunity. And that's what the younger generation want. Whether or not other countries want to join, I think other countries are interested in joining because now they see kind of the fruition from the agreement. Any form of agreement and dialogue between different countries in the region to kind of to create peace and security, we're up for it. And so we're not going to stop anyone from moving towards a peaceful agreement.
So to stick with the Abraham Accords for another minute, there used to be an old saying way back when, the road to Arab unity goes through Palestine. And this idea that the way to bring Arab states together was, the liberation of Palestine, or at least deal with the Palestinian issue. What's so interesting about the Abraham Accords is it sort of turned that on its head. So you have, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan getting into these different types of new ties with Israel. And obviously for a lot of Palestinians feel not only left out, but perhaps, betrayed by this. What is the UAE's position on Palestinian issues, on what's the relationship between Israel and Palestinians, the settlements, all of that, and how do you sort of mesh that with this very positive relationship you're developing with Israel itself?
So we've noticed that the old traditional ways in dealing with the Middle East peace process hasn't really been working. One of the main elements of the Abraham Accords was to put a hold on annexation. The UAE has always been committed towards a two-state solution and very much committed to the Palestinian people. The Abraham Accord is a new path and a new tool towards dialogue and diplomacy, allowing for more opportunities and jobs for people living on that ground. Again, in the end, the way forward or the peace towards a two-state solution will fall back, on the laps of the Palestinians and the Israelis. And in the end, it's both sides who will end up deciding what agreement they want. But we will ensure that, there are other means and tools that we can use to ensure that we can extend and have a dialogue towards a peaceful kind of solution. We think of the younger generation. We no longer want any fighting. When you ask the Israelis and the Palestinians, they just want to have basic rights and basic needs. They want a job. They want to make sure that they come home safely. And so this is a way to allow that. Many people, many countries, and many individuals, when we first signed the Abraham Accords, didn't really understood the Abraham Accords. And so, you would leave them expressing their emotions, but it only takes time to actually show the benefits and the results of the Abraham Accords.
Yeah. Well, I think it could very well be this could be maybe the road to peace goes through the Abraham Accords, and I think
we hope
there will be definitely more interest, I think, on the Israeli side to develop these relationships and perhaps lead to something a more positive, move towards a two-state solution. I certainly share that hope. Let me switch a little bit, still keeping in the sort of the international or foreign policy aspect of UAE. UAE is celebrating its 50th anniversary as an independent federation of Emirates. Before that, up to 1971, was part of the Trucial States, which included not just the UAE, but also Bahrain and Qatar, if I remember correctly. And they were all a British protectorate. And so the British pull out. Can you just sort of maybe just take a couple minutes and sort of explain for the audience what happened with that? How did the UAE develop, moving away from sort of, I guess, a strategic relationship or a dependency on Britain, but with more relations with the United States? And the fact that Bahrain and Qatar were previously part of the same political arrangement with you guys, does that still have any kind of lingering positive aspects to it? I mean, I know there's some tension between UAE and Qatar. What about this past, and how did you move from sort of a British sphere of influence to this very positive relationship with the United States?
So before the British, it was the Portuguese, and the British came and kind of colonized the region for 120 years. Bahrain was a dynasty, and a few countries in the region were under the Bahraini dynasty. The UAE was part of kind of the trucial states, along with Bahrain and Oman. You know, we traded with rupees, Indian currency. Each of the Bahrain had a different color, India had a different color. You know, Dubai, Abu Dhabi had different colors, etc. So when in the late 1950s, 1960s is when a lot of our oil started to kind of resurface. Around that time, the British colonizers were thinking of already pulling out, and so, you know, Bahrain became a country when, you know, we're looking at unifying the rulers of the other two countries. Used to meet a lot in the UAE. We talk about unifying and kind of how to move forward, creating a country. Bahrain decided in the end that they wanted to, you know, historically, because they're a dynasty, wanted to create their own country. Qatar decided that they wanted to also create their own country. And so we end up with, to begin with, we actually became an emirate with 6 emirates. 2 months later, Ras Al Khaimah joined, and so we became seven emirates. And so that's kind of how the transition. I think it was more timely than anything. It was, you know, not economical for the you know, the Brits to stay longer. And so kind of, you know, we learned from the expertise of the British. Each of the rulers would actually bring in a lot of the private sector to come and look at the infrastructure development. And this not only included the Emiratis, but also the Indian diaspora that lived on the grounds in the UAE. And that's kind of how, you know, I guess, you know, we developed from there, but there was always this big ambition. Again, we're only 50 years old. And so we've seen other countries develop and evolve and progress and kind of, you know, done a lot of mistakes throughout. And so for us, it was much easier to see kind of, what is it, the things that we want to emulate? What is it, what we want to kind of aspire to? And so there was always this progressive vision for the UAE. Though small, I think one of the biggest things we wanted to do is we wanted a country that kept growing and providing opportunity for its people, a country that you know, had really strong, secure borders, a country where we want other people to come live in. And so that's kind of, I think, how the momentum kind of went. But we're also very you know, grateful and thankful to have such a visionary leadership, kind of very open leadership with its people. The dialogue still continues, and I think you see that in the progress of the country.
Very good. So as over these 50 years, as the country has developed, one of the things that in your presentation that is very interesting is just how diversified the economy has become from, I mean, it was pearls, then it was very much oil dependent.
Yeah.
Can you sort of talk about how the decision was made to diversify from oil, and what types of things were done initially? Was it hard to do? Was it like a difficult process? For other countries that may want to do that, you know, what types of, how might UAE actually be a model for diversification?
So as I mentioned, you know, our economy was initially dependent on pearl diving, and then the Japanese came and created artificial pearls, which took over the market. And then thankfully, you know, oil was explored. But we've always known that we want to avoid putting all our eggs in one basket. If we look at Dubai, for instance, Dubai has been out of oil for over 2 decades, and it kind of recreated itself by building this foundation and kind of economy built on services, re-exports, and kind of worked from there. And so if you look at Dubai, I think Dubai is a wonderful case study as to how diversified the economy was. Dubai kind of put the UAE on the map, and then Abu Dhabi, etc. Now people know the UAE, and not only know it from Emirates Airlines, for instance. And so I think there is that movement towards that. We're also we're a country that, where water is very scarce. And so food security has always been an important an important threat for the UAE. By diversifying, we would kind of have a stronger buffer for our economy. The financial crisis, for instance, was, I think, kind of the worst and the best thing that happened to us, because that actually pushed us even further to diversify and move away from kind of conventional means of economy. We're 30% of our GDP comes from oil revenues, and we're moving towards, by 2050, to basically celebrate our last barrel of oil. And so, we have those really, really positive and progressive goals that we want to move forward, because we need to adapt to the global changes. And that's, if we don't diversify, it may be too late to do that later on.
So with this diversified economy, a relatively small population, I believe it's around 9 million or so for the country.
Around 10 million, yeah.
About 10 million.
Mm-hmm.
And only about 13% are Emiratis. Is that accurate? So
correct.
The majority are foreign nationals who live in the UAE. The traditional model for most governments in terms of raising revenue is taxation. How do you raise revenue? How are foreign nationals? What is their position in the country, given that they're the actual majority of the population? Can you sort of talk a little bit about the internal workings and I guess the culture of a country where only about 13% are actually full citizens and members of the country itself?
So we've we allow for expats and residents to own businesses. Initially, it was located in specific free zones that would give them full ownership. Today, they can own property. Any form of property in any single part of the UAE. Tax has been introduced into the UAE economy, I would say around 4 or 5 years ago. And that's kind of an income tax, around 4 or 5%. We also have kind of, as the population grew, traffic became pretty bad in the UAE. And so we have these poles kind of going through between each emirate. And so there are different kind of sources of income that we are gaining. But it's basically the attractiveness of living in the UAE and having them invest and reinvest in the UAE is something, the purchasing power and kind of making sure that there's more money being circulated in the economy is what's been helping us in the UAE. Re-exporting has been huge. So a lot of the electronics in the UAE are being sold back to Asia because it's cheaper. So that's, so there are a lot of bits and pieces that actually helping regenerate money into the UAE economy.
And in terms of foreign nationals, what's their position in terms of rights, things like that?
So so recently there have been a number of social and economic reforms. So as I mentioned, they can now own businesses outside free zones 100%. We now have given them, for specific groups who kind of have clean profiles or been living in the UAE for a long time, they're given these golden visas that can stay kind of as long as they want. We also have, so there are a few benefits. It's so much cheaper for them to set up base in the UAE because they would pay less taxes. It's also very safe, and a lot of people who are living in the UAE have left their countries for a better opportunity, and the UAE is still very close to their hometowns, and so for them it's a win-win because they're living in a place where they don't have to pay too much tax. The facilities are available. Infrastructure is great in the UAE, and it's basically 2-hour flight from their hometowns, or maximum 4 hours. So 2/3 of the countries, so you can go to 2/3 of the countries from the UAE, and kind of it would take you 8 hours from the UAE and you go to 2/3 of the countries in the world. And so it's a very kind of geostrategically located. And so there are kind of a lot of benefits for why a lot of people would come to the UAE and live.
Very good. So we're going to, I'm going to open it up to do some questions from the chat in a minute, but I'd like to, I guess, finish my last question with you. One of the things that was very, very impressive in your presentation, and I think was probably surprising for a lot of people in the audience, is the level of gender equality in the UAE. And I'm wondering if you could just take a minute or two to talk about that a little bit more in depth, and perhaps by actually sharing a little bit of your story. How did you, what was your path to end up being, you know, a senior diplomat at the U.S. Embassy? I mean, at the embassy in Washington.
So in terms of gender equality, I think what many people don't know much about the Middle East culture is society revolves around women, especially the mother, the grandmother, kind of an important source in our society. Before independence, women would do everything. The men would go out fishing and pearling for months, and women would have no other source of income other than, do some kind of home business and kind of making sure that they have coming income. And so there has always been this appreciation for women and the role of women in kind of upbringing generations and the role in the economy. For us, it wasn't very difficult to have kind of a gender equality or move towards kind of the empowerment of women. 30% of our population are women. And so obviously, our government does not want to neglect that. They contribute to the economy for sure. We have, as I mentioned, 50% of our parliamentarians women. 60% of the employees in the government sector are women. 30% in the private are women. And there is a big push and a lot of economic reforms are happening now to allow more women to go into the private sector, not just home businesses, like facilitating opening bank accounts, opening a business license that will take you 5 minutes. So everything has been kind of done to make it easy for women. Policies are changing. We have an institute called the Gender Balance Council that specifically works on revising all the government laws and bylaws and policies, and recommends it to the FNC or our parliament and works towards amending them. And so we have, and that's not only compiled by, composed of only women, Emirati women, but also expats and also men. And so we hear a lot in the UAE that men in the UAE, are asking for their rights because women are given too much. And, for us, it's like, you've had your chance. So it's extremely progressive, as a woman growing up in the UAE. I was born and raised in Dubai. I never felt, a sense that women were unable to do anything. I grew up in a household where, don't use the excuse that you're a woman, you can do anything, right? So I come from a very business-oriented family. Entering the government is not something my parents were proud of. I think, again, for me, studying development economics too, the government was not something I wanted to pursue, but I accidentally or luckily landed on my first government job after leaving banking. And I just fell in love with it because there's a lot of work that's being done that no one sees. And the first thing I was tasked to do was work on, women's rights, women's empowerment, but also something that I never thought I'd be working, which was combating human trafficking and child protection. And so that for me kind of triggered the ambition in me, because there's a lot of work that's being done. Again, we're only 50 years old, and but we've done so much, and we're still working towards bettering the country for the sake of our people. And I think that for me, it just kind of hit me in a soft spot. And I'm in government today, and I am the deputy chief. Not a position I thought I would be, handling and doing, but it's been remarkable. I think the challenging part of it is, balancing my marriage. My husband, is kind of in between Abu Dhabi and DC. We've been married almost 12 years. 7 years of that is basically in between. And it's been a challenge with 3 kids. But, my husband's extremely, open. Our families have accepted it. I think this is kind of the new kind of norm of, working couples, I guess. But it's women have a definitely strong say in the UAE, and you'll see a lot of them everywhere, if you do go.
Oh, terrific. That's really very impressive. Yeah, and I look forward to visiting. I have not been there yet, but I would definitely, that's definitely a place I want to go.
Yes, please.
So we have a few minutes. I know you have a hard stop around 8 o'clock. So I see in the chat, and please, anybody has questions, just direct it to me personally, and then I'll go through the questions. There's actually a couple of questions about the U.S. Pullout from Afghanistan, and what was the UAE's position on that? And also, does the UAE have any preconditions for recognizing the Taliban?
Okay, so on Afghanistan, the UAE has been one of the first Arab countries working side by side NATO and the US since 2003. We were part of this coalition on combating extremism and extremism on the ground. The pullout, the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan is a decision that the Americans made for their troops. We, as part of the international community, we're working with the United States and the international community in ensuring that the Afghans are evacuated safely, that they're kind of protected inside Afghanistan. The UAE and a lot of countries in the world are kind of in talks with the Taliban to ensure that our message to the Taliban are conveyed, ensuring the protection of people, avoiding, human rights violations, ensuring that the Taliban commit and stick to the commitments in order to be recognized, if any. And I think at this stage in time, we're working together to protect the Afghans. The situation has always been dire, and no one wants to see more suffering in the region. Countries bordering Afghanistan have been the countries that have been taking the brunt of it. Again, we work together for a better future, and that would mean working together. We are, towards diplomacy and dialogue and communication, and it means talking to the Taliban to ensure the safety of the Afghans. We will do that, and so have many other countries done that. Afghanistan has been, I think, touched us all, and this only shows that we need to have, pull all efforts to work towards kind of protecting the people.
Okay, thank you. Another person asked about, we were talking before about the large number of people from foreign nationals in the UAE, but beyond the ones who are expats living there and investing and owning homes and things like that, a large number are service workers, foreign workers, domestic workers, and the reputation for how they are treated in other parts of the Middle East and in the Gulf is pretty bad. What's the situation for guest workers and service workers of lower socioeconomic status in the UAE?
So this is a thing that the UAE has been working on for decades. The UAE, again, is only 50 years old. It's a country that abides by the rule of law. We have been implementing tremendous amount of policies and regulations to ensure that all kind of service workers or low-income workers are being, their rights are being protected. We are moving towards kind of ensuring their safety. we enforce bank accounts for them in the UAE. We enforce medical insurance. They have kind of a hotline to complain in case any of the workers, faced any issues. Again, we also have this dialogue called the Abu Dhabi Dialogue. And it's basically a dialogue between the UAE, a receiving country, and the sending countries. A lot of human trafficking from the sending countries has taken place through recruitment agencies in their home countries. And so we work together with all our stakeholders to ensure that everyone's being protected before coming to the UAE as well. We also have a wonderful relationship with a lot of the embassies on the ground there, who's kind of are the sending countries. But there's contracts, laws, violations, all that is being in place. Execution is on the go, and we're not perfect, but we are working towards taking all these kind of constructive criticism and improving our policies. And I think we've done extremely well. Again, the Middle East, but then there's the UAE. So I think kind of the understanding needs to be kind of different.
Yes. No, definitely. In fact, there's maybe I'll ask a follow-up question that actually was posed by someone else here. And that is looking at, given sort of the move towards gender equality in UAE, does it make your country seem, or maybe be seen as sort of a cultural threat to some of its neighbors, where gender equality, I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia, where that is not the case? I mean, is there a way in which maybe there's pressure on you to maybe not do as much, or is there a sense of, again, how does that relate to your relationship with the Saudis, which has a very different attitude?
So we're a sovereign state, and so is Saudi. And so any internal decision we make is a decision that the government makes, my government. We've always been this open, even before independence. We make decisions and ensure that this is the right thing for our people. Saudi Arabia is opening up. They're giving women more rights, driving, etc. So they are emulating us. They are kind of seeing that in order to develop and progress, they'll need to make some changes. Like many other countries, we're not perfect. We don't want. It may not be a kind of whatever the UAE kind of policy and structure is may not fit all countries, but it works for us, and we're always kind of moving towards tweaking it. Again, we're a country in the Middle East, a Muslim country in the Middle East, and so there are certain things that will take longer than others, but for us, I think we've always been moving really fast.
So let me flip that question around, because you said something really interesting. Is it, obviously you get a lot of tourism, and you get a lot of tourism from other parts of the region. As people go back to their countries, Saudi Arabia or elsewhere, and seeing what they've seen in the UAE, do you think that your country is actually being a catalyst for change in the region in terms of the cultural and gender issues?
Yeah. So we actually get approached by a lot of other governments on governance structures and policies. And so, the UAE is open to teaching others how kind of our case study. Again, having countries in the Middle East have strong kind of cultures and tribal groups. And so it may not fit for all. And I think that depends on how open and educated their societies are. You don't want to surprise them and say, okay, remove the shayla and everything, that's going to work for you, right? You kind of need to respect certain customs and traditions and gradually kind of work on that and then expand. In the UAE, again, it's not fully open. There are tribal systems, there's, very open societies, but people live together peacefully because we got accustomed to it, even before independence. And so for us, hearing different languages, seeing people practice different religions was never really new to us. And I really can't compare the UAE case to any other country. I think we just have we've been quite fortunate to have this unique structure.
Very good. Well, I think this is a great way to end it. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you and learning about the UAE. And I want to keep us on time for you, so I'm going to pass this on to Larry. And thank you so much for taking the time and for giving us such terrific answers and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Ms. Gargash, and thank you, Pierre, for that really interesting interaction. I thought you did a great job, Pierre, in dealing out the questions, and it was really a great eye-opening experience to have access to you, Ms. Gargash. It's really fantastic evening. There's so much happening in and around the UAE, and it's so important for us to understand and appreciate achievements that have been made in the first 50 years, and the diplomatic interactions between our two countries and between the UAE and the other countries in the Middle East. There's so many dynamics there, and it's really interesting to understand the differences and the role that you can play, the moderating role that you can play there. I know that we can continue this interesting conversation indefinitely, but schedules tonight do dictate that we bring it to a close for the evening. So please mark your calendar for our next distinguished speaker on January 20th. We'll send you the spring lineup very soon, and we've got some surprises in store for you. I think you'll enjoy them. You can find more information about all of our programs on our Indiana Council on World Affairs website at indianaworld.org, where you'll also find a recording of this and many previous programs. So for now, on behalf of the Indiana Council on World Affairs, we once more thank our distinguished speaker, Deputy Head of Mission, Ms. Shaima Gargash, our moderator, Pierre Atlas, and all of you who joined us this evening. Pierre, Shaima, would you like to say a final good evening? Good. Okay. I wish you all a good evening. I hope to see some of you again at our ICWA holiday party on Tuesday, December 7th, and at future ICWA events. Good night to all. Thanks again for joining us, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us. Thank you.
Thank you.